First, those lines have to be isolated so that you don't inadvertently try to power up cities along the way. All the substations along a predetermined cranking path disconnect their transformers to isolate the transmission lines and create a direct route. Once the black start source starts up and energizes the cranking path, a baseload power plant can draw electricity directly from the line, allowing it to spin up. One trick to speed up recovery is to black start individual islands within the larger grid. That provides more flexibility and robustness in the process, but it creates a new challenge: synchronization. Let's go back to the model to see how this works. I have both generating stations running now, each powering their own separate grid. This switch will connect the two together, but you can't just flip it willy-nilly. Take a look at my oscilloscope and it's easy to see that these two grids aren't synchronized. They're running at slightly different frequencies. If I just flip the switch when the voltage isn't equal between the two grids, there's a surge in current as the two generators mechanically synchronize. We're only playing with a few volts here, so it's a little hard to see on camera. If I flip the switch when the two generators are out of sync, they jerk as the magnetic fields equalize their current. If the difference is big enough, the two generators actually fight against each other, essentially trying to drive each other like motors. It's kind of fun with this little model, but something like this in a real power plant would cause tremendous damage to equipment. So during a black start, each island, and in fact each individual power plant that comes online, has to be perfectly synchronized. And this is true outside of black start conditions as well. I can adjust the speed of my motors to get them spinning at nearly the exact same speed, then flip the switch when the waveforms match up just right. That prevents the surges of power between the two systems at the moment they're connected. You can see that the traces on the oscilloscope are identical now, showing that our two island grids are interconnected. One way to check this is to simply connect a light between the same phase on the two grids. If the light comes on, you know there's a difference in voltage between them and they aren't synchronized. If the light goes off and stays off, there's no voltage difference, meaning you're good to throw the breaker. Older plants were equipped with a synchroscope that would show both whether the plant was spinning at the same speed as the grid, or faster or slower, and whether the phase angle was a match. I bought an old one for this video, but it needs much higher voltages than I'm willing to play with in the studio, so let's just animate over the top of it. Operators would manually bring their generators up to speed, making slight adjustments to match the frequency of the rest of the grid. But matching the speed isn't enough, you also have to match the phase. So this was a careful dance. As soon as the synchroscope needle both stopped moving and was pointing directly up, the operator could close the breaker. During a black start, utilities can start restoring power to their customers, slowly matching generation capacity with demand as more and more power plants come online. Generally, the most critical loads will be prioritized during the recovery, like natural gas infrastructure, communications, hospitals, and military installations. But even connecting customers adds complexity to restoration. Some of our most power-hungry appliances only get more hungry the longer they've been offline. For example, an outage during the summer means all the buildings are heating up with no access to air conditioning. When the power does come back on, it's not just a few air conditioners ready to run, it's all of them at once. Add to that refrigerators, furnaces, freezers, and hot water heaters, and you can imagine the enormous initial demand on the grid after an extended outage. And don't forget that many of these appliances use inductive motors that have huge inrush currents. For example, here's an ammeter on the motor of my table saw while I start it up. It draws a whopping 28 amps as it gets up to speed before settling down to 4 amps at no load. Imagine the demand from thousands of motors like this starting all at the exact same instant. The technical term for this is cold load pickup, and it can be as high as 8 to 10 times normal electrical demands before the diversity of loads starts to average out again, usually after about 30 minutes. So, grid operators have to be very deliberate about how many customers they restore service to at a time. If you ever see your neighbor a few blocks away getting power before you, keep in mind this delicate balancing act that operators have to perform in order to get the grid through the cold load pickup for each new group of customers that go online. The ability to black start a power grid quickly after a total collapse is so important because electricity is vital to our health and safety. After the 2003 blackout in the US, new reliability standards were issued, including one that requires grid operators to have detailed system restoration plans. That includes maintaining black start sources, even though it's often incredibly expensive. Some standby equipment mostly just does that, stands by, but it still has to be carefully maintained and regularly tested in the rare case that it gets called into service. Also, the grid is incredibly vulnerable during a black start, and if something goes wrong, breakers can trip and you might have to start all over again. Utilities have strict security measures to try and ensure that no one could intentionally disable or frustrate the black start process. Finally, they do detailed analysis to make sure they can bring their grid up from scratch, including testing and even running drills to practice the procedures. All this cost and effort and careful engineering just to ensure that we can get the grid back up and running to power homes and businesses after a major blackout.